Okay, thank you. And speaking about the innovations, look at this. I'm all mobile now without any Jamaican help. So this is work that I've been doing for the last few weeks, I think, on the elderly in the labor market. And actually, this morning on the train, I was a little bit nervous about the term elderly. I wasn't sure how Americans will view this, but after Tzvi said it's actually what you said, it's actually a very good choice. It's with a positive connotation. So I'm normally not giving talks on topics on which I've been working for only a few weeks, but since I gave my word to Chaya, then I couldn't get back on that. But in fact, in the past, I was working on retirement of farmers, of self-employed farmers, and that was more in the context of the extended family that Avia was mentioning yesterday. Not so much from the labor market perspective. So today it's going to be a labor market perspective, and this is joint work with Kirill Schraberman from the Taub Center, and hopefully we'll get a lot of comments and suggestions today for continuing this project. So back to the numbers, and I'm going to throw a lot of numbers on you today. Talking about the elderly dependency ratio, it was mentioned yesterday. We saw yesterday the total dependency ratio, which is kind of flatter than this, but here we only divide the number of people over the age of 65 by the number of people in the working age. And we see it's been quite flat, like Ruth was saying before. It was quite flat until today, but today we're going to see a jump, and that's a fact. I mean, it's not an assumption. These people are already alive, so we know they're going to get older. There are some assumptions about mortality and migration, but it's minor. So we're going to see a lot of many more older people in the population, and the working age people will have to support many more people. And as opposed to Europe and perhaps even the US, where aging has become earlier, but they have fewer kids. So now we are getting into the position that we have more older people, but we also have a lot of kids. So the working population will have to support both their kids, their many kids, and the higher percentage of elderly in the labor market. So this is just for motivation. This is not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the income of households that are headed by persons of certain ages. I will compare different ages of household heads, and I'm going to see what happens to their income between 2001 and 2010. And then I'll do some estimation of, it's kind of a really descriptive analysis of the correlates of this change in income and how we can decompose it into effects of covariates and the effects of coefficients. And then if I have time, I'll repeat it for employment. So,
could you go over this again?
This one?
No.
Oh, this one.
So you're going to look at rates of change, compare rates of change?
I'm going to see in the empirical analysis. I'm going to look at the rates of change. But first of all, I'm going to show some numbers. So, but also rates of change. So, for the benefit of those who like it better, this is the per capita household income of households with different ages of the head of household. So we see that perhaps I'll stand over here. This is under 55, and you know the elderly is kind of a broad definition. So I'm starting from 55, 64. I'm getting there quite soon. So it's important to know what's happening over there. But this is the majority of the population, and we see no increase in per capita income. All right. Now, when you go to 55, 64, you see already a 7% increase in per capita income, and that becomes even larger when you go to older households. So perhaps this should be the last slide, because the economic situation of older households is becoming better over time compared to the rest of the economy. Now, if you break it into sources of income, then we see an increase in wage income, especially for those at 55, 64. I'm saying especially because 65, 74 actually had a higher increase in their wage income, but the amount is really small, so it's not a big thing here. But again, compared to the rest of the households, the elderly are gaining in per capita wage income. So their association with the labor market is probably higher, and we're going to see that also in the employment statistics. Self-employment, even more than that. Again, look at the 55, 64, 74, they gain a lot in self-employment income. Of course, there's no mandatory retirement from self-employment, so they continue if they can. Capital income. Again, the amount, the average amount is not large, but we see a large increase in the capital income of the elderly households. We see an increase in pensions, especially for the oldest. So the pension income is increasing. And we see actually a decrease in pension income for the younger cohort, which makes sense because these guys are postponing their retirement. So if in the past they took earlier retirement, now they don't do that anymore. So we see a decrease in pension income, but an increase for the older households. And the last is transfer income. We see a decrease in transfer income for the younger cohorts, and that's because of the budget cuts that we experienced in Israel about 10 years ago. But especially for the oldest old, we see an increase in benefits. So, yeah. No, not individual. I'm looking at households, and by the age of the household head.
This age group was not in the labor market, and now there are. You're not
possibly.
In a way
Possibly.
At the wage profile over the life.
Well, I did look. I did look at the wage profile, but not over the life cycle, because prior to 2001, the data is not that comparable. So.
Can you say that in general this reflects the higher participation rate of older people?
Yes, but we'll see that later on. Now, some comparison between population subgroups. We know we have problems with minorities, both ethnic minorities and economic minorities, social minorities, the Arabs, the people in the periphery, outside of the, what we call, state of Israel, state of Tel Aviv, sorry, and immigrants. So we're going to look at their composition of income, not so much on the levels. We can also look at the level, but we don't have time for everything. So this is households with the heads under 55 years of age. You see most of their income is coming from the labor market, roughly 80% of even more than that. We see some variation across the groups, but that's not that important. Let's move to the older generation, 55-64. Now we can see an increase in labor income for everybody. But the increase, the labor income is the blue column here. So we see an increase in the importance of labor income, more so for the minorities, more so for the Arabs, and especially for the immigrants. This could be, in part, a reflection of the cut in the welfare payments that increased the proportion of labor income. And I don't have the more detailed decomposition in order to check that, but that's definitely possible. Also, look at the increase in capital income, especially for the minorities, especially for the Arabs. This is the red. It's it's very small, but it's increasing for all these minority groups. And for the people above the retirement age, we see, of course, a much lower proportion of income coming from the labor market. But it's also increasing, except for the Arabs. The Arabs see a decrease in the labor income. Look at what happens to immigrants. They get much more involvement in the labor market. They get higher income. And the oldest old, not so much attachment to the labor market. It's really marginal. But we do see a difference in the pension income. So the pensions of the minorities, especially the Arabs and the immigrants, is rather low. And but for the immigrants, at least, we see an increase in the level of pensions that these guys are getting. For the immigrants, it's important to note. I mean, many of the things I will say actually reflect the fact that these are now more veteran immigrants, because all these immigrants came to Israel at about the same time, but now they are 10 years older, so they accumulate more years in Israel, accumulated more capital, more pension. So the fact that they are improving in this situation reflects the number of years they've been in Israel already. So go back to the numbers. I'm using data from income surveys in Israel for 2001 and 2010. And you can see the increase in average per capita income of households that I now combine the older two groups. So 65 and over, you see an increase of about 20% in their per capita income. You see more female-headed household in that group. Not so much difference in the age, and that makes sense because we've seen that there's no change in the number of elderly in that situation, and there's no, perhaps longevity is not still showing up here, but perhaps it will show up in later cohorts. We see higher schooling, and that's going to turn out important in the results that I'm going to show you. We see a much higher fraction of Arab households in 2010, and a slightly higher fraction of people in the periphery and immigrants. So the first thing I do is I run some simple regressions that do not reflect any causality here, but just correlation to see what is correlated with per capita income of these households. And everything is significant here, so I don't even mark it. So you can see that female-headed households are not doing that well compared to male-headed households, but the difference is going down by about half between 2001 and 2010. So comparatively, female-headed households are doing better over time. We see a positive return to schooling, which makes sense, but also an increase in the returns to schooling. And that we also know from previous studies. We see negative coefficients of household size, Arabs, periphery, immigrants. That also makes sense, but note that for Arabs, periphery, and immigrants, the coefficient becomes larger in absolute value. So these, over the years, these households are doing worse compared to the majority of the population.
There's a comment, everything is as I would expect, except for the immigrants, because there is an accepted wisdom that the immigrants are more and more absorbed into the Israeli labor market.
No, this is not the case. And Simon has, Aberfeld has presented, maybe Black, I don't know, presented a paper recently that shows that actually they are going down.
So maybe there was a trend of going up and now it's reversed.
Yeah, exactly.
If you look at too many indicators, then you're going to see some of them going in the opposite directions, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm going to do with these results, I'm going to use this blind error decomposition of regression results. And this is more words than I normally put on a slide. But the alternative would be to put equations. So I think for your sake, it's better this way. So what this decomposition is doing, it's taking these regression results from two different groups. And for our case, it's 2 different years. And looking at the change in the average dependent variable and see what fraction of this coming from the change in the variables and the explanatory variables, and what fraction is coming from the change in the coefficients. And also you can look at particular coefficients and particular variables to see how much they contribute to the change in the dependent variable. So this is what I'm going to do here, and this is the total difference in the per capita income. Here it's 17%, but it's the predicted increase. The actual increase is actually a little bit higher. And what we can see is the characteristics, the variables, do not contribute anything significantly to the change. So this change in explanatory variables as a whole does not explain the the higher per capita income. It's only the coefficients that explain that. But if we go deeper and look at particular explanatory variables, we see that they do have significant effect, but sometimes they cancel each other out. So if you look at particular explanatory variables, we see that some of them are actually, or most of them are actually significant. So for example, you see a positive contribution of schooling. So an increase in the amount of schooling of the elderly population actually increased their income, the per capita income, by close to 5%. Okay, these are log income regressions, so it's all in percentage. So it's a 5% increase coming from the increase in 1 year of schooling on average. And the increase in the fraction of, say, Arab households and immigrants in the periphery actually has a negative effect, so that decreases, because these are lower income groups, so that decreases the change in per capita income and actually cancels out the effect of schooling, so the net comes out to being close to 0. What about the coefficients? Fewer of the coefficients have significant effects here, but one in particular that I want to pay attention to is schooling. So the increase in the returns to schooling, but that's, returns to schooling, for the economist of you, you have to be careful. I mean, these are not causal, so it's kind of a correlate, but let's call it a returns to schooling. So the increase in the returns to schooling contributed about 12% increase in per capita income of elderly households only. So now I want to move to employment, and that's coming from a different survey. That's a labor force survey in Israel, but looking at the same years and the same population groups. But here from the beginning, I'm separating into subpopulations, and you can see an increase in the age group of 55 to 64. These are males. We see an increase in the employment rate of all population subgroups. You see that the Arabs have a much lower employment rate. For younger generations, for younger ages, that's different. At the beginning of their career, the Arabs have about the same employment rate as the Jews, but as they get older, they drop out of the labor market, and the employment rate is quite low. But all of these increase their employment rate, especially the immigrants. Look at the immigrants; they have the most remarkable increase in rate of employment of this age group. Going to the older. These are including, if there are new immigrants coming in, that they will add up to this pile. I'm not following the same immigrants. But we know that the majority of these people came about the same time in the 90s, so there's some additions, but not it's not going to change the results significantly.
In terms of periphery, it's always the same area? Because
yeah, it's, yeah.
A place that was in the periphery in 2001 can be now in the center.
Well, no, let's not go that far, but it's, periphery is what we called outside of Gedera-Hedera region. So I hope this stays the same.
What does it look like for other countries? If we look into this age group, is there an increase in employment from 55 to 64?
Let's leave that for future research. You don't want him to ask the questions anymore? Okay. No questions. No, that was good for me because I don't have an answer. I will show some comparisons, but not of the changes, okay? So going to the older age group, we also see a much lower employment rate, but an increase in employment rate, and not so much for the 75 plus years old. For those, you see, for the majority of the population, you see a decrease in employment and some increase again for the immigrants. But again, the numbers are really low. These are not really large employment numbers. Females, about the same story. Lower participation rates of Arabs. The gap is actually much wider for women, for females than for males. But all of them are increasing their employment, especially the immigrants. And for the older group, again, you see an increase, perhaps a little bit more moderate. And for the oldest old, you see a decrease in employment in the periphery and among the majority, stability among the Arabs, and some increase for the immigrants. So let's do the same decomposition trick now with the employment rates. So these are the statistics. Again, the means are a little bit different because these are not household heads. These are the entire population of 65 plus years old. But again, you see not so much of an increase in age, but an increase in about 1 year of schooling on average, and an increase in the Arab population, in the periphery, and the immigrants. Again, just a small increase, but an increase in the immigrant population. The employment regressions, I regress the dummy variable of employed, unemployed on this bunch of explanatory variables. Everything falls into place. Positive coefficient of schooling. Everything is significant again, except for this asterisk. So I use the opposite convention of putting asterisks on those who are not significant, just to save the ink. And so again, all these coefficients they make sense. These are the Arabs, the immigrants. They tend to work less, But for the Arabs, for example, you see higher coefficient in absolute value. So the employment prospects are actually deteriorating over the years, while for the immigrants, we see a smaller coefficient in absolute value, so the employment prospects are increasing over the years. So let's see how these end up affecting the overall change in employment. So the total employment rate increased by about 2% between 2001 and 2010. And again, the characteristics or the change in the variables did not have any significant effect. It's mostly the change in the coefficients. But again, particular variables did have an effect. And again, it's and these results make sense. The increase in 1 year of schooling increased the participation by about 1%, increased employment by about 1%. And for the Arabs, we see the increase in the Arab population actually decreased the overall employment rate of this elderly population. And for the coefficients, nothing insignificant except for the periphery here. So the fact that the periphery has a negative and a larger in absolute value effect on employment is actually caused the employment rate to decrease by about less than 1%, not that large. Let's look at international comparisons now. I only do this for 1 year. So and I think Ruth also mentioned this that we are in the bottom of the list of advanced countries in terms of employment. This is for the 25-54 years of age. The red is Israel. The green is OECD average, and the dark blue is G7 countries. And we see that for this age group, our participation rates are much lower than in the rest of the world. But the situation is improving. When we go to the older age group, 55-64, we're actually doing better than the average OECD employment rates. And the difference is not as large for the older, but still we are not in a too bad situation. And also for, no, that's females, that's too much. I think I'm missing the 75 plus, but let's worry about that later. For the females, age 25-54, we have higher participation, higher employment rate than in the OECD, lower than the G7. You know, the OECD has a large proportion of Turkish and Mexican countries that actually take the averages a little bit down. So perhaps the G7 is a better comparison. So we're not that far from there. Our women are working significantly more than the males in international comparisons. And when we go to older cohorts, that also our females are doing quite well. 65-74, it's about the average, a little bit less than the average. And here I do have the right slide that's showing that among the 75 plus years, the women are working much less than that. So this is from an earlier study of mine when I look at cohort. This is actually following cohorts of employees using labor force statistics. And if you look at the oldest cohorts, so these are the guys who are now in their 60s and 70s, you see that their employment rate are not that different, but you do see, this is for men, you do see that when you go to a younger cohort, the employment rate goes down. So the younger cohorts tend to work less, even when they get to older ages. The difference is not that large. But if you look into the future and you look at these, those who were born in the 40s, you see here there's some indication that these guys are going to work more when they get old, if this trend continues. And also if you look at those born in the 50s, okay, this is my generation, you see that they are catching up with those born in the 40s around the age of 55. So if this trend continues, perhaps we will see in future generations higher participation, even higher participation rates of older people. Even compared to the international community, they are doing quite well these days. For women, we see the opposite picture. When you go to younger generations, they tend to work more. Again, the differences are not that large among those who are already among the older population. But when you look at those born in the 40s, you see that they're going towards much higher employment rates of females, and also in the 50s. So perhaps this trend is going to continue. by the way, when you separate these into educational classes, you see that most of the difference between the cohorts is caused by education. So so the fact that younger females tend to work more is almost entirely due to the fact that they have more schooling. Okay. So let me summarize just the findings by a few sentences. We do see that the elderly population has increased their employment, or also saw an increase in their per capita income between 2001 and 2010. So they enjoyed higher labor income, but also capital income and pensions, and even saw an increase in their transfer payments, especially for the oldest old. We do not distinguish between public and private transfers, so it may be from private sources, but at least they do get this to see this increase in income. If you look at the population subgroups and on those disadvantaged groups, the Arabs, the periphery, the immigrants, especially the immigrants, seem to be closing the gaps with the rest of the economy faster than the other population subgroups. And we saw that especially the education, or the higher years of schooling among the elderly population, is contributing to higher per capita income and to higher rates of employment, and eventually allow this population to keep the standard of living higher than perhaps the population of older cohorts or current older people. So what can you say about the future? Since if you look at education statistics today, we already know that tomorrow's old people will be even more educated. So as more and more educated people are getting into the labor market, and this is as opposed to what we see in the US, where actually reached kind of a steady state in terms of the rate of educated college graduates. In Israel, we still see an increase, and it's going to rise. So we're going to see more educated people coming into the labor market. So if these trends continue, we expect that they'll also participate more and have higher per capita income. During their employment years, they'll accumulated more pension capital, and we know that we now have mandatory pensions, so this future elderly population will have higher pension income. They also accumulate financial assets that can contribute to their capital income. Now the other point of view is that when you look at the younger males, in particular, we see that they have lower participation rates. So perhaps when these people are going to get old, we're not going to see the same trend of increasing employment. So perhaps it's a kind of a generational issue. Perhaps we're moving into a society in which leisure is more important than, and people allow themselves to not to work as much as older generations. And so the fact that the profile is becoming lower, but it's flatter, so it doesn't allow us to tell what happens when these people get into old age. And of course, if we consider life expectancy, that's another thing to worry about, because perhaps these people that are now engaged in the labor market more than before will have to save, even after retirement age. They have to keep saving to cover their between 100 and 120 years old. They have to survive somehow. So it's not clear that their level of well-being is going to be higher than what we see today. Thank you.